for agentic AI. To start the presentation about the topic, I wanted to tell a true story. Or maybe should be a thriller or something. Recently, we were talking to an organization, the leadership of this organization, and they were very excited explaining how they were deploying agents in production. They have 10,000, 13,000 agents or something. And then one of my colleagues, teammate, a very smart young guy, asked, okay, so how do you govern this number of agents? How do you do an agent lifecycle? And then they basically respond in 3 short sentences. We don't do this. We don't need agent lifecycle. Agent just die. And then I said, well, how come? So humans also die. They get fired sometimes, or they just decided to stop doing business with online shop and delete the account. And still we do lifecycle management in all these 3 type of use cases. So that's how we are, how the world is at the moment, deploying agents. And the fact is that identity and access management has been built having humans as a primary actor. And agentic AI introduced new type of problem, mainly because of the non-deterministic nature of these entities. The agents interact with APIs, tools, call other agents and everything. So that's raised several questions for our industry, for ourselves. How do we identify agents? How do we trust on these agents? How do we know what authority and it's acting under? And how do we hold accountable when something goes wrong? So basically, we have 3 great panelists here to walk through this topic today. Raul Goda, software engineer from LinkedIn. Niv Goldenberg, co-founder and CPO from our Links Security. And David Goldschlag, co-founder and CEO, Aembit. So to start the panel, I want to ask you to introduce yourself and also respond, how do you define identity for AI? You can start with David.
I'll start. Can everybody hear? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm David Goldschlag. I'm co-founder and CEO at Aembit. We do IAM, Identity and Access Management, for agents and other non-human workloads. Okay. So to answer your question, we focus on the A in IAM. So I think that when you talk about identity, what really matters is access, or access and authorization, because you're not really looking at identity for its own sake, right? Like, I care who you are because I care about you, okay, right? But for an agent, they come and they go, okay, what we care about is access and then audit and attribution. So you'll hear me coming back into this frequently throughout the next 20 minutes, that let's talk about access and authorization, because that's identity is in service of access and authorization.
Hi everybody, Niv Goldenberg, co-founder and chief product officer at Links Security. I've been in security for the past 20 years, started on the offensive side and then moved to the defensive side. And the way that we define identity for AI in Links actually tells a little bit the story of my career, because we also look at what is the risk. And I absolutely agree with my colleague here, David, about the access and the focus on access, but I think that access and risk are the things that we focus on, because if the access is not risky, then maybe we should take care of other things. At Links Security, we provide a unified identity security and governance platform for human, non-human, and agents. And when we talk about accountability, when we talk about auditing, what I find super exciting now in identity for AI is the need to model the complexity, is the need to understand the attribution, to understand who we are acting on behalf of, and then understanding who could be the one that will craft the policy, write the policy, approve different things, because things are going so much faster than they used to, so it's harder to understand what should be approved, what should be denied.
Hey everyone, I'm Rahul. I'm a software engineer. I'm a practitioner. I build large-scale software systems, specifically towards the infrastructure security and applied cryptography. I've been in the identity and access management space for almost 6+ years now. To the question, how do we define an AI identity? I think it's first-class identity for the agent itself. We should realize it's a non-human workload identity, distinct from the platform which hosts it and the user which triggered it. It should be in a centrally registered place within your organization that you can assess who did what, on whose behalf, with what permissions, and you can prove it.
Okay, good. Coming back to you, David, as we are talking about standards, how to enable agents from different vendors, platforms, or enterprise to authenticate and collaborate without creating new silos. So what is the role of these standards and interoperable protocols?
Yeah, so I think standards are important, right? And for instance, in my business at Aembit, our job is authenticate an agent, check a policy, and issue a credential. And if more agents can authenticate themselves in a standardized way, and the credentials that I need to issue are more standardized credentials, it means it's less work to support a bigger variety of things, okay? So I think that that's really critical. But I think at the end of the day, this business of converting from one identity to one access credential to different ones, that one, the world's just a messy place, okay, right? And that's just my job, okay, right? And so I think we do need to recognize that even in a world of SAML, okay, for instance, for users, you still need identity systems like Entra or Okta or Ping, because they're the ones that manage the policies and the real work, right, of deciding what to do, determining posture and risk, right, making an access decision, issuing a credential, that is still sort of above those standards, okay? So that's how I think about standards.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to add to that, and I think that the standards are really an alignment in terms of a framework for us as an industry and the way that we need to look into make decisions. And I think that while there are some great standards, some of them still have some gaps or some deficiencies when we think about agentic actors, I think that's really anchoring what is the way to model an agent, what is the way to model access. Even if the standard is not yet widely adopted, I think that the pursuit on the standards and really understanding what is lacking in the current standards is one of the things that leads us forward as an industry. Because sometimes for the standard to be widely adopted, it could take a decade. As we're seeing now with agentic actors, we are being pushed, and we also have the incentive in terms of increasing productivity, delivering more value to adopt more agentic capabilities. And I think that their standards are lacking behind, but even the discussion itself on what do the standards provide us and what are the enhancements that we need to do allows us to start to build the right constructs across the entire ecosystem.
Okay. Yeah, just as a follow-up on this same question. So MCP is basically becoming a standard, interoperability between agents and external system. And the first release of MCP, there was no sort of security in it, no authorization. Then later, basically triggered by the community, the identity community mostly, an authorization layer has been introduced, and OAuth has been defined as a standard for MCP. Do you think the MCP is mature enough, or the authorization is mature enough to become the next, let's say, standard for agents?
I think MCP is used for accessing third-party services. I think initially, as you said, it did not have any authorization standard, but the recent version of the MCP actually started following some of the OAuth standards. It started with, I think, dynamic client registration, resource metadata, server finding, and also I think in a track to provide some security, but I believe the security should be a foundational infrastructure, and the auth and all will bake into it. Ultimately, that will give us the tool access that MCP needs. So MCP ultimately provides access to different third parties. Like if you want to access your Google Drive, if you want to access GitHub, you want to access Slack, all these third party providers, they have their own auth credentials. Like they have their own authorization servers. So ultimately, you need a way to get some form of access through these third party auth providers. MCP will give you the access to them, but you have to rely on these third party auth providers to get the access tokens. So there are different standards that are being come up. I think if you read online, you will find tens or hundreds of them, but you have to understand what's your use case and what works for you. I think here, my takeaway, or like if you want to take away with this panel discussion, is I can help you find what I think work for us and what can help you. Like there is a standard on agentic identity and access management, IETF draft that is coming out. I think that provides good foundation how to define agentic identity, how to do credential management, authentication and authorization and access. And then depending on a use case, like how the token or the credential flows in the system, like you have delegation tokens, there is a transaction token discussion that came up in the past. What do you want to do? Like there are multiple approaches to do, like to solve problems, but depending on the use cases that you have to adopt some of these standards to solve the problems.
I would say that MCP is not ready to be an enterprise-grade protocol, but no one asked us. And then it is de facto the enterprise protocol that is being used. And I think that at the end of the day, it's created a very positive trigger for us as an industry, because now we know what we need to focus on. Before that, it was which protocol and how do you strengthen it, how do you improve it. Now the question of which protocol is going to be the most widely used is not a question anymore. At least the deployment that I see across different enterprises, MCP for tool call, agent for agent is something that is picking up also for cross agents and communication. And now the discussion is what are the layers that I need to layer on top of MCP? And now there are the extensions of OAuth. Now there are additional type of extensions to different protocols, and also the provider themselves. There's been different IDPs that are now trying to help us do the authorization centralized from the IDP and not between the resources and the client. So I think that while it is not ready, it tells the story of, in many cases, the technology precedes the security controls, and then this is our responsibility as practitioners to be agile enough to react to this quickly, so the people in this room could sleep quietly at night, knowing that while the CIOs in the different departments are pushing for the agentic adoption, and they're using MCP, and they're knocking on their door again and again of, I want to connect this workload to the agents, I want to connect this one to Claude, they could do it with the confidence that they're doing something that's also secure. But I think that we're close to being there, we're not there yet.
Okay.
So if I may, I'd like to echo what Raul was saying, okay, is MCP gives you kind of an OAuth flow, okay, from the agent to the MCP server to the service. But then you need to have a policy system that determines whether the agent should get an OAuth token and what should that OAuth token give that agent rights to be. And I think that people should understand this, that the fact that MCP supports OAuth does not mean that you have a policy system that grants rights, okay? And we should realize that the policy system that grants rights is probably more complicated, okay, than the underlying flow. But you're right, this gives us a structure within which to live. Now, one thing we're seeing, you mentioned a couple of variants, MCP, agent to agent, things like that. We're seeing also a return to just agents accessing tools via APIs, okay? REST APIs using short-lived or long-lived credentials. And I think we're gonna see that it'll become increasingly heterogeneous. The same apps that you built a year ago are now gonna be agents, okay, calling LLMs, calling some MCP services, and calling some legacy services. And in all those cases, the agent or the app needs to reach out to an IDP or an IAM, authenticate, get a credential of whatever type, and then do the access.
Okay,
Yeah, just want to add, like, I completely agree. And also want to add that never give an agent any raw token. Yeah, like at that point, like prompt injection is not a vulnerability, it becomes a feature for your product.
yes, considering that, like you said, MCP is not fully read yet, but we still needed to apply some policy enforcement, authorization. In this agentic AI security architecture, where should policy and authorization be enforced? There are many, let's say, attack surfaces, different places. We have prompt injection, we have calling tools, external system. How a good architecture looks like for agentic AI?
Yeah, so just a couple things. The agent shouldn't be able to mint its own credentials. Okay, that would be bad. Okay, so you need a third-party system that decides what's possible and then issue a credential. Now, we are seeing some complexity here. Lots of people like gateways, right, that live between the agent and this. That's another enforcement point. Okay, so you can decide, authenticate the agent, give it a credential, and then you do tool filterings, for instance, at the gateway. We are seeing other models where you want to give the agent a little bit more sort of rights. And this is more, I love to use analogies. So when you go to Amazon to buy something, okay, Amazon to buy something, you authenticate, but it's the app that decides that you have access to your credit card. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not going to some IDP to do that. And I think we're going to start to see some things there where the business logic and the agent starts to do some of the authorization too, but primarily you want to pull it up to some other part of the system.
The business logic, you mean inside the agent, like a policy as a code, something combined with business logic?
Yeah, because you have context, right? The agent is doing work for somebody, right? And in some cases, you might get rights through the IDP for that somebody, but in some cases, the business logic may need to do some work there too.
I think that we're going to see different layers of policy and of enforcement that really depend on the type of architectures. You mentioned, for example, prompt injection, that I think that we're seeing more and more standard use of this as part of the network security. So whether it is in the browser or in the general web gateways, I think that we're seeing more and more MCP gateways and AI gateways or agent gateways that are then to enforce policies for the tool calls. We're going to see more around intent analysis and then enforcement that the token that was issued is a token that is scoped only for a specific intent that we've seen. And at least what I'm seeing now, and I think that this trend will continue, is that it's going to continue to be a combination of layers, that some of them will sit in the endpoint, some of them will sit in the network, some of them will sit in the workload. We're seeing now a very significant trend of more and more organizations that are shifting away from endpoint that runs agents to having a very strict policy that does not allow any endpoint-based agent runs, and then to sandbox everything in a managed cloud environment where you know that you can scale it, but you can also control it from all different angles that you want. So I think that we're going to see the same type of constructs that evolve to the new agentic risk and to the agentic environments. And for sure, or my view is that we're going to see also cross-policy orchestration coming, as there are going to be more than one policy engine and more than one policy enforcement for agent. I think that we're also going to see some cross-domains orchestration.
And how, before you touch on this as well, maybe you can also look at what about data authorization itself? What if an organization or a developer bypass MCP, or it's not calling a tool, but eventually calling a database? So how we introduce this data authorization, data labeling, and these kind of things that has been always outside of the identity and access management. It's a kind of a cited, let's say, domain. What's your view on this?
Yeah, when we say data handling, data labeling, I think you're hinting towards an authorization model, which is like context-aware authorization or like attribute-based access control systems. I think what Niv mentioned, right? Like
Even data masking, for example.
yeah, like, I think it need to be a layered approach for sure. Like in the whole identity, like agentic identity and access management workflow. I think we have to think from the registration part, like ensure that all of your agents are registered in a centralized registry, and they should be registered through some automation. Like it should not be any employee can register any agent in a system. You should have guardrails who can register within a centralized registry, because that becomes your source of truth for everything that agent is within your organization. Now, when agent gets a credential, like short-lived credential can be X509 certificates, auth tokens, OIDC tokens, ensure that you attest them. So there is a policy layer there as well, like who can get what credential with what lifetime, with what identity. So there is some policy authorization piece there as well. And once it gets a credential, it can use it for downstream API calls, like for MCP servers or for first-party applications, depending on the use case. Then data itself will do some form of authorization or access control there, depending on the policies that you have for your organization. So that's why I think it is a layered approach that you need to do depending on the use cases that you have.
So one thing I think we've been seeing is we're calling it kind of zero trust for agents, right? So just like you do zero trust for users, right, where you understand the identity of the user and the posture of the laptop that he's coming from or she's coming from, and you understand how to filter data, right, that you're saying, you probably need a similar structure for zero trust for agents. And I think the same thing applies there, okay? You got to authenticate the agent, you need to be able to understand its risk and posture, and then you need to be able to do some level of data filtering. And I think that gives you sort of a framework, the three-legged stool, right, for solving the larger problem.
I would add to that I think the challenge starts when there are multiple hubs of agents that delegate to another agent, that delegate to another agent, and then you lose track of who's the initial actor. When we think about an agent that just works on behalf of a single actor, I ask my Cloud cowork to then go and do different things on my behalf so I'll be more productive. Usually, the token that I'm using already includes all the information for the downstream application to control which data can I access and which data I cannot access. So in a way, this is a solved challenge. There's always the challenge of making sure that the data is classified right and that the policy are enforced in the right way. But when we're starting to think about an agent that spins up another agent and another agent, just like a multi-agent architecture, then it's where it becomes more challenging. One of the research papers that I read recently that I like the most is the one of Uber that explains how do they manage this chain of trust between all the different sub-agents that they're running. And this also takes me back to the protocols when we're looking at extensions and implementation of protocols that allow us to continue to pass the information and the context of who is this access performed on behalf. So I think that there in these multiple hubs, this is where we still have challenges, and then we're seeing different toxic combination and violations of segregation of duty. And this is something that I would expect that both on the protocol side and also on the implementation side, we're going to be more advanced there to be able to address these type of risks.
So we have something that we call token exchange, and we agree exactly with that. So let's say you have a user going to an agent, going to a gateway, going to an MCP server, going to a resource. You really don't want to give the agent the credentials for the resource, okay? You should give the agent the credentials to get to the gateway, and the gateway the credentials to get to the MCP server, and the MCP server the credentials after doing token exchange to get to the resource itself. And so this is another example where I think, we kind of understand what we need to do, right? And there's no way that that'll all be standardized, because the resource may end up being an Oracle database. Shout out to Oracle, start to use short-lived credentials. But But the point is, right, is the world is messy, but token exchange gives you a way, right, to go from step to step and not over privilege any of the hubs.
And how do you ensure that this delegation it will be properly scoped and eventually revoked? So is there any architectural patterns or standards emerging from it?
I think, yeah. So auth delegation token is something that is present in the IITF drafts for auth. It has different new drafts present on having a chain delegation tokens. There is also transaction tokens that is coming up, which has more permissioning within the token itself. So there are different ways, but do ensure that you always delegate. Don't impersonate whatever the agent does. Don't allow agent to impersonate the user. Give it its own identity. Ensure that it does proper delegation. You can have multi-hop delegation. You can have transactional tokens any way which you like. Ensure that your access control does access based on intersection of the permissions of all the delegated chain identities.
So I have a perspective here on delegation. I agree entirely. Don't do impersonation. The agent should not be able to say that it's David. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. You lose attribution there. The problem with delegation is that you sort of assume that rights get more narrow, right? The user has lots of rights. The agent gets some subset of the rights, okay? We're seeing that the situation's a lot more complicated than that, right? You may go to an agent, the agent should get some subset of rights, but the agent might also get some other rights that it's entitled to that don't come from the user, okay? Or you may be after an agent where you want to do a query that touches more sensitive data, but the agent's entitled only to give the answer back, right? You know, not the actual data, but some answer back. So I think we need better language here, because delegation has this thing where you're sort of saying, you know, less, okay, right? And really what you're saying is it's a calculation.
I would add to that I think that the understanding of what is the intent is a key part here. Because usually when you delegate something to someone, you tell them, hey, could you please do this on my behalf? And then it's true that we want to reduce the permissions as we delegate further and further, and just not to create this sprawl and this explosion, but also the ability for us to analyze the intent, to capture the intent, to pass through the intent, so it won't get lost. This is also another key component to this that will allow us to provision at the right time, just the right type of privileges to make sure that they're used for the right actions, that the output is just like you said about masking or reduction of data. It's something that does not break any other policy or does not create any peripheral risk that we didn't think about. So I would say that these two are things that I see working more and more together. And it also starts, we talked in the previous panel, they talked about agent lifecycle. I think that it starts there with understanding what is the goal of each agent, what is the intent, what are the things that it should be allowed to do. And in some cases, this is the trickiest part for us. Because even for human, as we think that we got it fully solved, sometimes when you ask, okay, so what is the type of access that this person needs to have when they join an organization? In some organization, the answer is still, oh, you know, just give him the same access that the last person in the team received. So even being able to define what is the role, and I think this is another challenging aspect of managing agentic access, because basically each one of us becomes a manager. And as manager, to define how do we scope responsibility, what do we expect each one of the agent to do, what we expect the sub-agent to do, sometimes this is even more challenging than delegating the right access.
Yeah, I want to add, I think I agree to both. And this is where the open standards are lacking. I think, like, none of the open standards talks about permissioning, like agentic and agentic registration. Like during registration, what it should do, like what should happen, like, and if you want to define some permissioning or scoping for that agent itself, that can be less or more than a user who triggered the agent, depends on the agent identity. So that's where I think the open standards need to evolve.
Okay, so there's a lot of development need in the standards. I think we will have some people from ETF and OpenID Foundation along this week. Maybe we can also ask and discuss this topic with the experts in the standardization. Just moving to the governance part itself. So one of the things is how we, assuming that agents act autonomously and at machine speed, so basically it's a consensus. How do we ensure this transaction integrity and traceability and continuous assurance of AI agents?
So just a couple things there, right? Is the agent needs an identity, right? That then lets you do a calculation of what its access rights are. So the agents, however, live in lots of different places, okay? And this is related to a question you're going to ask a little bit later, is how do you get the identity for the agent? So when the agent lives in your own infrastructure, you can often get its identity. But when the agent is from a SaaS service, okay, it's often hard to get the identity of that agent. And so I think that there's certain places where the industry needs to work a little bit more to be able to help systems that need to grant rights to be able to authenticate them where they're not living right inside your own environment. On the workload side, this has been done pretty well already, right? So for instance, GitHub and GitLab or Terraform can authenticate the agents, right, that are working, the actions that are working on their own. So there's probably a model to do that. And then you get an identity, and then you can start to, in real time, issue the shortest lived credentials, right, and then refresh those and track them.
I would add the additional layer of traceability and also about audit. I think that the authentication is the foundational part and really making sure that you have the identity. But I think that now more than ever, it's really important to keep a very accurate and as real-time as possible log of what does the agent do. What does the agent do? Because as we know, one of the main challenges that we have is that we think that the instructions that we give are very clear, and then what the agent or the agentic entity is going to perform is going to be very close to what we asked it to do, but sometimes it translates in a different way. And I'm not even speaking about prompt injection or any type of attack. I'm simply speaking about the fact that sometimes when we write the instructions or the prompt, we make it in an ambiguous way, and then the type of downstream impact is something that is harder than to roll back. So I would say that one, make sure that you have a very good ability to monitor the different actions, be able to classify which actions are significant in terms of unreversible impact. For those, make sure that you have the ability to also involve a human in the loop, because there is still a human that is accountable. The reason that we're sitting here is because we're accountable as a community for the implementation and adoption of these agentic new capabilities. And there are cases in which saying that we put together the right process in place, the right policy engine, the right authentication is not enough. So still make sure that you have a mechanism that could trigger for the right person the request for inputs so they can make it in real time. And then also have the ability to establish a baseline and then understand deviation from baseline. And this, I would say, is going to be one of the most challenging things, because we're now at a time that models keeps on evolving. The way that model evolves is also means that the interpretation of the different instructions and the execution plan that agents are going to put for different tasks might change over time from agent to agent. So without taking us to the discussion about evals and the importance of putting them around agentic actors, I would say that have a very tight auditing and the ability to stop in real time actions that you're going to regret that you didn't know before they happened.
Yeah, in terms of governance, I think the fundamentals, I think it still remains the same for agentic identity and access. I think these comes in 4 problems. I think you should know who is who, what they can do, on whose behalf, and you should have ability to prove who did what. I think, and we do have solutions in the industry. I think ensure you have verified agentic identity, and you do delegation, don't do impersonation, have universal audit trail, and an access control which can stop and kill things when we want at runtime. I think these are very hard things, like easy to say, but very hard to implement, coming from the experience. Like, and yes, I think there are many open standards out there. Depending on the use case, try to pick and like read all of them and apply which works for you.
Good. We are approach the end of this panel. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes, maybe. Just a quick.
Can I like ask one thing to David, like maybe to Nev? Like,
Go ahead.
in the initial discussions, David mentioned that identity is in the service for access and audit. I think this sentence comes in probably from the question that why do we need identity? I think I will say more. Think of what happens when identity is impersonated. Or think, second question, like what happens when it is stolen? So your thought of like thinking of identities in service of access and audit, I think may have more broader thoughts.
So just to react, and then I'll answer your question. I never said that identity didn't matter, okay? And in fact, I'm a huge proponent that if an agent is doing work on behalf of a person, you need to know the agent's identity in a strong way, in addition to the user's identity, okay? I'm just saying that we shouldn't lose track or a sense that our purpose here is not to give agents identity, but it's in order to determine what agents are allowed to do and then to be able to audit them, right, and track it after. Now, you were asking, what do we need to do downstream, okay, right? I think that for most part, applications that agents log into, okay, you end up with a service account, okay, right? The agent is given a credential, or the MCP server is given a credential to log into the service account. I think that model is too blunt, okay? We should be able to give an agent the rights to access and do certain operations within an application instead of mapping it necessarily to a role or a service account identity, okay? Because a lot of the things that we want to be able to do to shrink rights to a zero trust model, okay, is the agent, by its intent, should be entitled to do a certain thing and not necessarily get all the rights that the service account that the credential is being issued is entitling for. I think that this is a big path because this is asking vendors, right, application vendors, to start to expose those sorts of things, okay? But I think that people need to go in that direction, okay?
Quick.
I would also add from a different direction. I think that now as an industry, we're storming and forming. And I would say join the storm and have a seat at the table that allows you to also shape how it forms. I think that, just like we said, some standards might be lacking. Some of the controls might cover 90% or 95% of what you want. But I think that now more than ever, we as practitioners need to build, try, iterate. Just like with AI, it's not a one-time prompt that like on the first attempt you get exactly the output that you need. The same way the type of architecture that you now put in place and the type of controls. So I would encourage everyone to make sure that you select a tool, try it, deploy it, see how it helps you. If it doesn't help you, maybe try a different approach. But I would say that here and now, the velocity is going to be something very important for all of us as a community. And it's not that if we sit and just think what will be the right solution, we'll get to it. It will be around lots of iteration and very quick adoption feedback loop.
Yeah, I think in terms of standards, like we can have multi-year debate whether agent human is not, whether agent is a human or non-human. I will say, like, do hands-on, like think of it as non-human, start thinking of it, what tools and frameworks and standards we have today, what applies to them, and what use case they solve. Like I do strongly suggest of reading Agentic Identity and Access Management, IETF draft. It moves towards a SPIFFE-based identity system. It has good controls of how to specify trust domain, what your unique identity should look like, how the attestation should work. Once it gets an identity, what the credential rotation and credential authentication system should work, and then move towards whenever you make an API call to downstream services, think of auth frameworks, auth standards. Now within auth itself, like I agree, it's a web of like lot of IETF drafts and frameworks. But I think or read more on the delegation part, on the transactional token part, and then move towards the access part. In access control systems also, like auth again comes in. You can have permissioning system, you can have access scope within the token itself, but that's also like very challenging when you do things in production. And then the access system, which is again a very complex piece of what do you want to do, how do you stop bad actors to doing the bad things.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the panelists. It was a great insight.